There is a small cylinder of granite, no longer than a hand, that has rested in a museum drawer in London for more than a century, and almost no one who walks past it knows that it may be one of the strangest objects the ancient world left behind. It was not carved into anything. It was not meant to be seen at all. It is a piece of waste, the plug of stone that fell out of the middle of a drilled hole nearly 5,000 years ago, discarded by a craftsman who is long since dust, kept only because he happened to throw it where the desert would preserve it. And running down the length of that discarded plug is a mark, a single continuous groove, spiraling around the stone from top to bottom as evenly as the thread on a screw, cutting straight through the glittering quartz and the paler feldspar without seeming to care which is harder. We know, more or less, how the Egyptians worked granite. We can name the tools. We can walk to the quarry where the stone was freed. We can even take copper and sand into a workshop today and repeat the work with our own hands. And still this one small groove on this one small core does not quite fit the clean story we like to tell. That is the thread this long night will slowly follow, and it does not lead where you might expect. If you can feel this calm slowly carrying you off, press like before it does, and stay a while with a subscribe, but only if something in these words holds you. Tell me, if you wish, from which corner of the world and at what hour you're listening. It comforts me to think of all the others who are still awake in this same hour. To understand why a single scratch on a lump of waste stone can unsettle serious people, it helps to feel the size of the difficulty the Egyptians faced, because it was not a small one. Granite is not an ordinary stone. It is one of the most stubborn materials in the natural world, born of molten rock, cooled slowly and deeply under enormous pressure, until it hardened into a dense mosaic of interlocking crystals. Shot all through it are grains of quartz, and quartz is very hard indeed, hard enough to scratch glass, hard enough to turn the edge of iron, sitting near the very top of the everyday scale of hardness that most stones and metals fall well below. Against that, consider what the Egyptians actually held in their hands. Their principal metal was copper. Soft, reddish, useful copper, which can be beaten cold, dented with a fingernail, and worn down against hard stone the way a bar of soap wears down against a wall. On the scale of hardness, copper sits far, far beneath quartz. And yet, here is the plain, undeniable fact that the whole mystery grows from. A civilization equipped mainly with copper and stone reached into one of the hardest materials in its entire landscape and did as it pleased with it. It sawed granite. It drilled clean round holes through it. It carved statues from stone darker and harder still, and then polished their surfaces until they shone like still water. The results survive by the thousand, scattered across Egypt and the museums of the world. What survives far less well, what barely survives at all, is any plain, honest account of exactly how the thing was done. Sit with that gap for a moment, because it is the true home of the mystery. On one side stands the object, absolutely real, cool and heavy and undeniable, its surfaces cut and bored and polished to a finish that would satisfy a modern workshop. On the other side stands a silence, no manual, no diagram, no apprentice's notes on how coarse the sand should be or how hard to press. The people who did this work left mountains of their finished output and almost nothing describing the process. And into that empty space every kind of explanation has rushed over the centuries. Some careful and patient, some wild and thrilling, some frankly impossible. The groove on the little core is simply the place where the gap becomes small enough and sharp enough to hold in one hand. It is not a legend. It is not a rumor told around a fire. It is a measurable feature on a real object in a real collection, and it has been measured again and again by people who very much wanted it to behave itself and stop being strange. It has not entirely obliged. And to feel why that matters, it helps to remember the sheer scale of what the Egyptians did in this most unforgiving of stones, because the little core is only one small survivor of an enormous ambition. This was a civilization that quarried single shafts of granite as tall as a modern building and stood them upright as obelisks, each one a single unbroken piece weighing hundreds of tons, dressed on all four faces and often carved down their entire length with crisp hieroglyphs. It cut sarcophagi from solid blocks and hollowed them true. It raised seated colossi of hard, dark stone that dwarf the people who stand at their feet. And it floated all of this, the obelisks, the statues, the facing blocks, hundreds of miles down the Nile from the southern quarries to the sites where they would stand, on barges, on the flood, an entire logistics of stone moving through a world without iron or wheel, as we would understand them. The finished works are so numerous, so confident, so casually enormous that it is easy to stop seeing the difficulty in them at all. We look at an obelisk and admire its size and forget to ask the harder question the little core forces back upon us. Not how they moved the stone, which is astonishing enough, but how exactly they shaped it, how the edges were made so straight, the holes so round, the surfaces so smooth, in a material that should have laughed at every tool they owned. The core is small precisely so that the question can be held in one hand. But the question behind it is as large as everything they built, and the strangeness is specific, which is what makes it hard to wave away. It is not that we cannot imagine how granite might be cut at all. It is that this particular mark on this particular kind of leftover seems to have been made a little too easily, a little too regularly, a little too indifferently to the hardness of what it passed through. A soft copper tool fed with loose sand ought to leave a wandering, uneven, slightly random surface, favoring the weaker minerals and stumbling over the stronger ones. That is not quite what the finest of these cores show. They show a groove that descends in a clean, unbroken helix, biting through the hardest crystals in the stone as though they offered no more resistance than the soft grains around them. The man who first measured this in detail more than 100 years ago was no dreamer. He was the most careful and quantitative archaeologist of his age, a man who distrusted romance and lived by the ruler. And even he wrote that the ease of the cutting was something he could not fully account for. So the question that will hang over everything that follows can be stated very simply and then left to deepen. If loose sand did the cutting and loose sand is loose, why does the mark look as though the tool itself bit the stone, straight down and utterly unconcerned with what it was made of? That groove is the thing to hold on to through everything that comes after, because it is where the tidy explanation first begins to strain, and the tidy explanation is genuinely good. It deserves to be stated fairly and at its full strength. The answer that resolves the copper against quartz paradox is this. The copper was never the thing that cut. The copper was only a carrier. Beneath the moving tool, fed steadily into the cut and kept wet, went sand. Plain quartz sand, made of the same mineral and therefore just as hard as the quartz locked inside the granite. The individual grains caught and rolled between the soft metal and the hard stone were what actually ground the rock away. The copper wore down as it worked, thinning and dishing and needing constant replacement. But that was an acceptable price, because the sand between it and the stone was doing the real damage. Wet the cut, and the powdered stone and worn metal turned into a grey slurry that carried the debris out and brought fresh grains in. It is a beautiful solution, and it is almost certainly correct in its outline, because it dissolves the paradox completely. You do not need a tool harder than the stone if your tool is only a clever way of pressing something as hard as the stone against it, over and over, for a very long time. This is not a modern guess pulled from the air. Grinding hard materials with loose abrasive is an ancient and well-attested practice, and it leaves marks we can recognize. It is worth dwelling for a moment on how strange and how ordinary that process really is, because most of us have felt it without naming it. Anyone who has ever smoothed a rough surface with sandpaper has used exactly this principle. The paper itself is soft, but the hard grit glued to its face does the cutting, and the paper is only there to carry the grit and press it down. The Egyptians simply did the same thing with the grit kept loose in water instead of glued to a backing. Under a spinning copper tube, or beneath the long stroke of a copper saw, the wet sand became a grey, gritty paste, and every rotation or draw of the tool dragged a fresh crowd of sharp grains across the stone, each grain plucking away a fleck of granite too small to see, the whole surface disappearing not in chips but in dust. The copper vanished into that same paste at its own steady rate, which is why so few large ancient copper tools survive intact. They were consumables, worn to stubs against the work they did. Watch the process and you would see almost nothing dramatic. A man turning a shaft, water and grey mud welling up around the cut, the level of the tool sinking so slowly that from 1 hour to the next you might swear it had not moved at all. That patience, that near invisibility of progress is the whole character of loose abrasive work. And it is precisely that character, slow, gentle, undramatic, faintly random, that makes the confident, deep, machine-like regularity of the troubling cause feel, on close inspection, so quietly out of place. Consider the sound of it, if nothing else. Not the ring of metal on stone, not the sharp crack of a chisel, but a low, wet, grinding hush. The shaft turning, the sand hissing in its slurry, water trickling in to keep the cut cool. The same soft rhythm repeated for hours until it became the whole world of the man performing it. Egyptian granite work was not loud. It was patient and murmuring and endless, closer to the sound of a river wearing at a bank than to anything we would call cutting. That is the texture of certainty in this craft, a quiet, drowsy, near-eternal grinding. And it is against that gentle background hush that the one sharp anomaly stands out, a mark that looks as though, for a moment, the river had teeth. But watch carefully what the sand answer actually delivers, because it is not quite everything. It explains that the work was possible. It removes the impossibility, which is no small thing and should not be undervalued. What it does not, by itself, explain is the particular character of the marks the Egyptians left on the finest of their cores and saw cuts. Think about how loose sand behaves when you actually use it. It wanders. It rolls and skids and packs unevenly. It abrades a surface into something soft-edged and slightly random, the way a sanded piece of wood or stone looks when you run a fingertip over it. Smoothed, yes, but not sharply grooved, not cleanly threaded. Loose grains, working by chance and pressure, ought especially to treat a mixed stone unevenly, chewing faster through the weaker feldspar and skating over the harder quartz, so that the surface ends up faintly textured, the tough crystals standing up in tiny relief where the softer stone was carried away around them. That kind of texture does exist on some worked Egyptian surfaces, and where it exists, it is exactly what the sand theory predicts, and everyone is content. The trouble lies with the exceptions. On certain of the drill cores, the groove is not soft-edged and random at all. It is regular, it is continuous. It descends in a clean, even spiral, and where it crosses a crystal of quartz, it does not falter, does not fade, does not lift. It goes on cutting at the same depth, as if the drill had never noticed that it had passed from soft stone into the hardest mineral in the rock. The man who measured this, most famously, said as much in plain words. He wrote that the grooves ran through quartz and feldspar with equal ease, and that this equality was, to his eye, the single strangest thing about them. He could not picture loose sand doing that. Loose sand, by its nature, should discriminate. It should leave the record of its own laziness, the soft parts eaten and the hard parts spared. A mark that treats the hardest and softest minerals identically looks less like the work of rolling grains and more like the work of a fixed, hard edge dragged deliberately through the stone. Something with real teeth, something that simply does not care what lies in its path. And that is the exact discrepancy that has kept this small argument alive for well over a century. It is not a large thing. It is a fraction of a millimeter, a matter of how deeply one mineral was cut compared to its neighbor. But it is a stubborn fraction, and it will not be tidied away by simply repeating that sand can cut granite. Of course, sand can cut granite. The question is whether loose sand, and only loose sand, can leave this. So before chasing that fraction any further, it is worth going to the one place in this whole story where nothing is mysterious at all, where the method lies open to the sky, the tools still resting in the trenches they cut. It is worth going to the quarry to see what certainty in this subject actually looks like, so that the uncertainty, when it returns, has something solid to be measured against. Nearly 700 miles up the Nile from the Great Pyramids, the stone itself still waits in the ground, and the ground still remembers being worked. At Aswan, where outcrops of pink and grey granite break the desert into low, bare hills above the river, lie the ancient quarries that fed the monuments downstream, the obelisks, the colossal statues, the hard stone facings and floors of temples now hundreds of miles away. And here, at least, the mystery lifts. Here the method does not have to be reconstructed or guessed at, because it was left behind half-finished, frozen in the act. Lying in its rock bed, still joined to the bedrock along its underside, never freed, never raised, is a single obelisk that would have weighed something well over 1,000 tons had it ever stood upright. The largest single piece of worked stone the Egyptians are known to have attempted. It was abandoned exactly where it lay. Partway through the enormous labor of cutting it loose, cracks opened along its length, ruining it, and rather than waste more effort, the quarrymen simply walked away and began again elsewhere. That abandonment, disastrous for whoever answered for it at the time, is a priceless gift to everyone who came after. Because the Unfinished Obelisk is a workshop caught mid-motion, and it answers a question that might otherwise have joined all the others in the dark. Walk along the trenches that surround it, the narrow channels cut down into the living granite to isolate the block on every side, and you can see quite literally how the freeing was done. And it wasn't done with blades, it was done with balls. Scattered in and around the trenches lie rounded lumps of dolerite, a dark, tough, iron-hard stone, harder than the granite around it, and these were the tools. Not to slice, but to pound. Held in the hands or perhaps swung on cords hour after hour, day after day, they were hammered against the surface of the granite, bruising it grain by grain into powder, driving each trench slowly, brutally deeper. The evidence is not subtle. The trench walls and floors are covered in a coarse, pockmarked skin of overlapping shallow bruises, the record of countless individual blows, the surface literally beaten into submission and swept clear of dust. There is nothing hidden in it, nothing that needs a lost civilization or a vanished machine to explain. It is muscle and rhythm and time, and a great many people willing to pound stone in the sun until the block hung by a thread and could be levered free. The dolerite balls themselves survive by the hundred, scattered across the quarry floor where they were dropped when they cracked or grew too small to swing, some still bearing the battered, flattened faces where they struck the granite 10,000 times over. Stand in that landscape and the whole enormous chain of the work becomes, for a moment, visible and human. The Aswan granite breaks the desert into low, rounded hills of rose and grey, the same stone that colours temples hundreds of miles to the north, and everywhere across those hills are the scars of ancient extraction. Half-freed blocks, abandoned trenches, the ghosts of works begun and given up. To free a block was only the beginning. It then had to be dragged from its bed, levered up onto sledges or rollers, hauled down to the river's edge, and loaded onto barges that could carry it downstream on the annual flood, when the swollen Nile rose high enough to float such impossible weights closer to the temples and tombs that waited for them. The obelisk lying in its bed never began that journey. It failed at the first stage, cracked in the cutting, and so it stayed. And in staying, it preserved the one part of the process that would otherwise be hardest to imagine, the patient bruising of a giant loose from the living rock. There is no mystery in it, and that is exactly the point worth holding on to. When the Egyptians left their method in the open, it was brutally, reassuringly simple. The strangeness only gathers where they took the method with them, into the finer, more delicate, more precise operations that no abandoned quarry ever caught in the act. Stand in one of those trenches and the certainty is almost physical. This, and only this, is how a giant block was separated from the earth. And that very certainty is what makes the next step feel so much stranger. Because bruising a great slab loose from the bedrock with hammerstones is one problem, and boring a smooth, round, deep hole straight down through the heart of that same slab, cleanly enough to leave a spiraled core, is a completely different one. The quarry answers how they got the stone. It does not begin to answer the mark on the little cylinder in London. A young Englishman arrived at Giza in the winter of 1880, with instruments finer than anyone had thought to bring before him, and a temperament that could not leave a measurement alone. His name was Flinders Petrie, and he had come to survey the pyramids with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. He slept in an empty rock-cut tomb to save money and time. He worked at night when the site was cool and quiet and the tourists were gone, sometimes stripping down to his underclothes in the heat of the passages. He measured the great structures with surveying gear he had partly built himself, chasing accuracy down to fractions of an inch, determined to replace the wild speculation of earlier writers with hard, checkable numbers. He's remembered now as one of the founders of scientific archaeology, the man who taught the field to be patient and quantitative and suspicious of its own excitement. And that is exactly why what happened next carries weight. Because it was not the vast triangles of masonry that unsettled him most. It was the small things, the worked granite, the sawn edges and drilled holes, and, above all, the discarded cores, the leftover plugs of stone pulled from finished drill holes and thrown aside thousands of years before, which he began to gather and study with a slowly growing sense that the numbers were not adding up the way they should. He handled saw cuts in hard granite, where a blade had left long, straight, parallel striations running the length of the stone. He examined the walls of drill holes and the surfaces of the cores that had come out of them. And he did what he always did, he measured. On the cores, he studied the spiral groove and read its pitch, the vertical distance the groove dropped each time it wound once around the cylinder, which is a direct record of how far the drill had advanced with every single rotation. And the figure he arrived at sat uncomfortably in his notebook. The tool, if the groove told the truth, had sunk into solid granite far faster than the slow, grain-by-grain grinding of loose sand seemed able to allow. He knew how slowly abrasive cutting went. He was not naive about it. Loose sand wears away almost as quickly as the stone it attacks, has to be renewed constantly, and rewards only enormous patience. Yet the mark on the core spoke of a bite that went deeper per turn than that patience appeared to permit. One core in particular, catalogued simply by a number, showed a groove so regular and so pronounced that Petrie set it down as a genuine puzzle. He wrote that the granite had been cut with an ease and a force that he, measuring it with his own eyes and his own instruments, could not fully explain. Coming from him, from the least romantic man in the field, the ruler and notebook skeptic, that admission is the quiet spark from which everything strange in this story catches fire. To understand the weight of that admission, it helps to know the kind of man who made it. Petrie had come to Egypt in part to test the wild theories of others, the strange numerical mysticism that had grown up around the Great Pyramid, the belief that its measurements encoded prophecies and cosmic constants. He arrived hoping his careful survey would confirm those grand ideas, and instead, his own instruments quietly demolished them, and he had the honesty to say so and to walk away from the fantasy he had half hoped to find. That is the temperament to keep in mind here. This was a man whose entire method was built on distrusting a beautiful idea until the numbers forced him to accept it, and who had already, once, let cold measurement kill a theory he found appealing. He was not looking to manufacture a mystery about drilled granite. If anything, he was constitutionally inclined to dissolve one. He gathered the cores and the sawn fragments not as curiosities, but as evidence, cataloguing them, comparing them, carrying some back to England where they still survive in the collection that bears his name. And it was out of that same skeptical, deflating, ruler-in-hand approach, the approach that had just finished puncturing the grandest pyramid theory of his age, that he found himself, almost against his will, writing down a number about a small granite core that he could not make behave. When a debunker builds a puzzle he cannot solve, the puzzle deserves a second look. It is worth pausing on why the pitch of a groove matters so much, because it is the hinge of the whole affair, and it is easy to let it slide past as a technicality. When a drill turns and cuts downward at the same time, it carves a helix into whatever it removes, and the steepness of that helix records the ratio between two motions, how fast the tool was spinning against how fast it was descending. A shallow, gentle spiral means the drill turned many times to sink a little way, which is what you would expect from slow, gentle grinding. A steep, coarse spiral, dropping quickly with each turn, means the tool was biting deep and advancing hard, taking a substantial cut of stone on every rotation. And it was a steep, coarse spiral that Petrie found on the cores that troubled him. Not the timid, patient thread of a tool nibbling its way through granite, but the confident descent of something driven downward with real force, removing stone at a rate that felt, to a careful measurer, out of proportion to the softness of the copper and the looseness of the sand. He turned the figure over and over. He was too honest to hide it and too cautious to shout about it. He simply recorded that the ease of the cutting exceeded what he could account for and left the number standing in his book like a stone in a shoe. Others would spend the next 140 years trying to remove it, and Petrie himself, faced with a puzzle he could not resolve by measurement alone, did the only thing left to a man of his temperament. He proposed a mechanism, a specific physical guess about what kind of tool could leave such a mark, and in doing so, he opened a door that has never quite been closed since. His explanation, when it came, surprised even him, and he offered it with the wariness of a man who knows he is guessing beyond his evidence. Petrie proposed that the copper tools had not relied on loose sand at all, or at least not only on loose sand. He suggested that the Egyptians might have set fixed cutting points into the soft metal itself. Hard gemstones, corundum perhaps, or even diamond, embedded into the edge of a copper saw or the rim of a copper tube like permanent teeth. If that were so, the tool would no longer be a mere carrier for wandering grains. It would be a true blade, dragging fixed hard edges through the stone, and everything that had puzzled him would fall into place. It would explain the regularity, because a fixed point traces a steady path. It would explain the steep, confident pitch, because a real cutting edge can be driven hard. And above all, it would explain the indifference to hardness, the way the groove cut quartz and feldspar to the same depth, because a fixed, jeweled tooth does not care in the slightest what mineral it crosses. It simply cuts straight through, letting the difference in hardness of the surrounding stone mean nothing at all. It was an elegant idea, born of exactly the feature that had first snagged his attention, and for a time it hung in the scholarly air as a serious possibility. But it never found the evidence it needed to stand. No such jeweled tools were ever discovered. Not one copper saw with gem teeth still fixed in its edge, not one drill rim set with corundum, turned up in any workshop, any tomb, any rubbish heap that archaeology has since sifted. And this absence matters, because Egypt has been dug through as thoroughly as almost any land on earth. Tools of copper survive, abrasive sand survives, half-worked stone survives, and so do the discarded cores themselves. If the Egyptians had routinely set precious hard stones into their metal tools, one might reasonably expect at least a trace of the practice somewhere in the vast surviving record of their crafts. There is none. And so the fixed point idea was, over time, quietly set down, not so much disproved as unsupported, left without the physical backing that Petrie himself would have demanded of anyone else. The consensus drifted back toward the simpler answer it had briefly wandered from. Loose sand, soft copper, water, patience, and time. That drift was reasonable. It was probably right. But notice what it left behind on the workshop floor. The very feature that had pushed the most careful man in the field toward jeweled teeth in the first place. The clean, deep, indifferent regularity of that spiral groove crossing quartz and feldspar alike was still sitting there, unexplained by the theory everyone returned to. The abrasive answer had reclaimed the field. It had not quite answered the specific question that started the argument. It had only reminded everyone that the general problem was solved and hoped the specific one would grow quiet on its own. And there is a further twist buried in Petrie's jeweled tooth idea that deserves to be drawn out, because it quietly refuses to die even after the theory itself is set aside. The reason a fixed hard point explained the mark so neatly is that it does not depend on the surrounding stone being soft. It carries its own hardness with it. Now, the Egyptians of the Old Kingdom had no iron worth the name. Their working metal was copper, later hardened somewhat into bronze, and neither is a match for quartz on its own. So whatever cut those cores, the actual hardness had to come from somewhere other than the tool's own metal. In the loose abrasive answer, it comes from the sand. In Petrie's answer, it came from gems set in the copper. But there is a middle path that neither camp fully articulated at the time, and it hovers over the whole debate like an unspoken third option. What if the copper, in the act of working, picked up and held the hard grains, pressing them into its own soft surface until the tool itself became studded with abrasive, a self-forming version of the jeweled edge Petrie imagined, made not by a craftsman setting stones, but by the physics of soft metal grinding against hard grit under great pressure? That possibility blurs the clean line between the two theories. It means the tool need not have been a passive carrier of wandering sand, nor a deliberately jeweled blade, but something in between, a copper face that armed itself as it worked. It is a small idea. But hold on to it, because when the whole story is finally drawn together, it turns out to be the thread that stitches the mystery almost, though never quite, shut. It did not grow quiet. It waited on a small cylinder of stone in a drawer for someone to come along nearly a century later and try to settle the whole thing, not with theory, but with his own two hands. Nearly a century after Petrie set his troubling number down in ink, a man in an English workshop set out to prove the simple answer true, not with argument, not with theory, but with his hands and a great deal of patience. His name was Dennis Stocks, and he devoted years to something that, remarkably, almost no one had done seriously and systematically before, actually reproducing ancient Egyptian stoneworking using only the materials the Egyptians are believed to have had. Not modern steel, not diamond bits, copper tubes, beaten and formed by hand, quartz sand, gathered and sieved, water to make the slurry, a bow to spin the drill, or a weighted shaft turned by hand, or the slow drag of a copper saw loaded with abrasive. He built the tools, he mixed the grit, and then he pressed them against real granite and real hard stone and simply began to work, hour after hour, recording how fast the cut advanced, how quickly the copper wore away, how much sand it took, what the resulting surfaces and cores actually looked like. It was unglamorous, repetitive, aching labor, and it worked. Slowly, laboriously, but unmistakably, he bored holes into granite with soft copper and loose sand, and he drew out cores that were recognizably the same kind of object Petrie had puzzled over a century earlier. He sawed hard stone the same way, and produced the same long striated cuts. Those experiments did something no amount of clever theorizing ever could. They demonstrated, physically and beyond serious argument, that the great paradox was not really a paradox at all. You could make these things with a Bronze Age toolkit. The copper tube spins against the stone. The loose grains of sand caught beneath it grind away both the metal and the granite. The rock yields in a fine grey mud of powdered stone and worn copper. And in the center of the deepening hole, a cylinder of untouched stone is left standing, taller and taller, until at last it snaps off at its base and comes free as a core. This is, quite reasonably, treated as the settled answer to the whole question of how. The method is known because the method has been repeated in daylight by a living person using nothing the ancient Egyptians lacked. And it must be said plainly and fairly, most of the mystery genuinely does end here. The impossibility is gone. The copper against quartz riddle has a working, demonstrated solution, and anyone who insists that granite simply cannot be drilled with copper and sand is arguing against a thing that has been done in front of witnesses. That is not a small achievement, and it is not one to be brushed aside in a hurry to reach the strange part. And it was not a single lucky experiment, which is what gives it real force. Over years, the same patient approach was turned on nearly every technique the Egyptians are supposed to have used. Copper saws drawn back and forth with sand beneath them, biting slowly into granite and basalt, throwing off the same long parallel striations that survive on ancient sarcophagi. Tubular drills of rolled copper, spun with a bow or weighted shaft, sinking into hard stone and leaving behind the telltale cylindrical cores. Even the hollowing of stone vessels through their narrow necks was reproduced. Borer and abrasive worked patiently through the constriction of the mouth. Each experiment measured what mattered, how quickly the cut advanced, how much copper was consumed, how much sand, what the surfaces looked like under close inspection. And across all of it, a consistent picture emerged. The methods worked. They were achievable with nothing the Egyptians lacked. They were also brutally, almost unbelievably slow and hungry, devouring copper, devouring abrasive, devouring human hours at a rate that makes the scale of the finished monuments harder, not easier, to comprehend. To cut a single sarcophagus this way was a labor of many people over many weeks. To face a pyramid in granite, to raise a forest of obelisks, to fill galleries with tens of thousands of hard stone vessels was an expenditure of patient effort so vast it strains belief. The experiments dissolved the impossibility and, in the same motion, deepened the human wonder. What they could not quite do was match the finest ancient marks stroke for stroke, and it is in that last small failure of the reproduction that the old question kept its foothold. But when the reproduced cores are set down beside the ancient ones and studied closely, small differences begin to whisper, and honesty requires listening to them rather than pretending they are silent. The modern experimental cores tend to be rougher than the finest ancient ones. Their grooving is often shallower, less even, less confidently helical. And above all, the work was slow, far slower, by many accounts, than the brisk rate that Petrie's arithmetic implied for the originals. Reproducing the process, it turns out, is not exactly the same as reproducing the precise marks at the precise speed the ancient cores seem to record. A demonstration that the thing could be done this way is powerful. It is not quite the same as a proof that it was done this way, at that rate, to that finish. And so the oldest nagging detail refuses to lie down and sleep. It has changed its shape, though, which is important. It is no longer the possibility that troubles the careful mind. Stocks answered the possibility decisively. It is the specifics, the steepness of that helix, the depth of the bite, the apparent speed of descent, and most of all still, the way the groove crossed the hardest crystal in the stone, as though the change in hardness had simply not registered. Every one of those features probably has an explanation somewhere in the physics of abrasive wear, tool pressure, and the accumulated skill of workshops that practiced for 1,000 years. But probably is a quieter, more honest word than certainly, and the whole distance between those two words is exactly the size of the residue this long story keeps circling. The method is known. The margin is not. And it is inside that margin that the next detail hides. The one about speed, which was the very thing that would not lie still. Speed was the detail that would not lie still, and speed is where the numbers begin to feel almost personal, because they touch the limit of what patience alone can buy. Return to what Petrie actually read from the spiral. The pitch of the groove, the drop per rotation, is a fossilized record of how aggressively the drill advanced, and the figure he took from it suggested a tool sinking into solid granite at a rate that would sit more naturally in soft limestone than in one of the hardest stones in the land. Loose abrasive is slow. Anyone who has ever tried to grind hard stone by hand knows just how slow. How the grains dull and round off almost as fast as they cut. How the slurry must be renewed again and again. How progress is measured not in inches per hour, but in the stubbornness of days. And yet the ancient mark seemed to speak of a bite that dropped deeper with each turn than that grinding patience should have allowed. There are ways to rescue the figure, and they are worth laying out honestly, because each of them is reasonable and none of them is confirmed. Perhaps Petrie's estimate was simply too high, read from an unusual or misleading core. Perhaps the ancient drillers pressed downward with weights far heavier than any cautious modern experiment has dared to load onto a fragile copper tube, forcing the sand into the stone hard enough to speed the cut dramatically. Perhaps the abrasive was not river sand at all, but something coarser and more aggressive, crushed emery or corundum-rich grit, harder and sharper than ordinary quartz. Each of these is a plausible rescue, but notice how they accumulate. When a single fact requires 3 or 4 separate maybes to bring it back into line, the very number of rescues becomes a kind of confession. It is not that the fact cannot be explained. It is that it has to be explained, deliberately each time, and never quite explains itself. To feel the sharpness of the second puzzle, hold a piece of granite up to a strong light and really look at it. It is not a smooth grey mass, but a jostling crowd of distinct crystals, glassy, translucent grains of quartz, blockier, opaque crystals of feldspar in pink or cream, dark flecks of mica scattered between them. These grew together as the molten rock cooled, interlocking like a 3-dimensional mosaic, and they are genuinely different in hardness. Run a hard point across the surface, and it will bite the feldspar more readily and resist longer at the quartz. This is not theory. It is the ordinary behavior of the stone. The reason a weathered granite outcrop develops a rough, grainy skin as the softer minerals erode away first and leave the quartz standing slightly proud. A drilling process built on loose grains ought to echo that same behavior on a small scale, leaving the quartz very faintly raised within each turn of the groove. What so struck the man who measured these cores was that on the most troubling examples it did not, that the groove appeared, if anything, to have bitten as deep or deeper into the hard quartz as into the soft feldspar around it, exactly reversing what patient loose grit should do. A tool that cuts hardest where the stone is hardest is behaving in a way that runs against the grain of ordinary abrasion. It behaves, in fact, like something pressing hard, sharp points straight through the crystal by main force, not rolling grains idly across its face. And that single reversed expectation, small as it is the flaw in the smooth surface of the settled answer. The place where a fingernail catches and will not stop catching, no matter how many times the rest of the surface is declared perfectly explained. And then there is the matter of the 2 minerals, which is subtler and, to some minds, stranger still. Granite is not one substance but a crowd of them, a mosaic of pale feldspar grains packed tight around glittering islands of quartz, and the quartz is distinctly harder than the feldspar it sits among. A loose abrasive, working by chance and rolling pressure, ought to register that difference. It should chew a little faster through the softer feldspar and skate a little over the harder quartz, so that a drilled or ground surface, examined closely, would show the quartz crystals standing very slightly proud. Tiny raised islands left behind when the softer stone around them was carried away, the way pebbles are left standing when a stream washes the sand from between them. That differential texture does appear on some Egyptian surfaces, and where it appears the abrasive theory is quietly vindicated. But on the cores that troubled Petrie most, that is precisely what does not happen. The groove seems to cut both minerals to the same depth, running straight across a quartz crystal without slowing, without lifting, without leaving it proud, as if the tool had passed from soft stone into the hardest stuff in the rock and simply carried on as though nothing had changed. A fixed, jeweled point would behave exactly like that. A loose, rolling slurry, in theory, should not, or at least should not so cleanly, so consistently on the finest examples. Somewhere in that small discrepancy, that fraction of a millimeter of difference in how deeply two neighboring minerals were cut, lives the entire reason the argument has never fully closed. It is a tiny thing to hang a mystery on, but it is stubborn, and it will not be argued away by insisting once more that sand cuts granite, because everyone already agrees that it does. And it points, oddly, away from the pyramids altogether, backward in time, to something older, humbler, and, in its own quiet way, even harder to explain than a hole drilled through a slab. It points to the jars. Before the pyramids rose, before the first obelisk was dressed, before granite drilling became a monumental art, there were the jars, and they may be the deeper riddle of the two. Among the earliest and most astonishing products of Egyptian stonework are the hard stone vessels, bowls, cups, plates, and tall, narrow-necked jars, carved not merely from soft and forgiving alabaster, but from diorite, from basalt, from banded schists and other brutally hard rocks, the very stones that would later humble lesser craftsmen. They survive in staggering numbers. Beneath the step pyramid at Saqqara, in the galleries tunneled under that first great stone monument, tens of thousands of stone vessels were found, many of them already old when the pyramid was raised above them, heirlooms and offerings gathered from earlier centuries and sealed into the dark. Some are so thin-walled that light passes through them, the stone glowing faintly at the edges, like frosted glass held up to a lamp. And the wonder is not only in the outside, in the smooth, curved flanks and the clean rims. It is in the inside, in the part no eye was ever meant to see. To make such a vessel, you must not merely shape its exterior, you must hollow out its interior, reaching in through a mouth that is sometimes barely wide enough to admit 2 fingers and scoop away the entire belly of the jar until the walls are even and thin all the way around, through that narrow neck, in a stone that turns copper soft, with the widest part of the hollow bulging far out, beyond the width of the only opening you have to reach it through. Now, we are not entirely without answers here, and fairness demands that they be given their full weight before any wondering begins. Tools have been found. Crescent-shaped flint borers, worn smooth and asymmetric from long use, survive from the workshops. Stone drill bits of various shapes have been recovered. And later, Egyptian tomb paintings actually depict the craft in action. A worker turning a weighted, forked shaft driven down into the mouth of a vessel, the whole clever apparatus designed to grind out the interior through the constriction of the neck, its forked bearing holding the borer steady, while stones lashed to the shaft press it down and keep it turning. One of the oldest hieroglyphic signs is thought to derive from the image of a drilling apparatus used on just such vessels. The craft was so fundamental that its tool became a written symbol. A tubular drill could remove a central core of stone, a shaped and cranked stone bit, wobbled and worked on its cord, could then be made to swing out and widen the belly of the jar beyond the width of its own mouth, grinding blindly at the inner walls it could never be seen to touch. Given centuries of refinement and lifetimes of daily practice, and the accumulated feel of masters teaching apprentices who would teach apprentices in turn, the thing is achievable. This is the sober, mainstream position, and it is very probably correct. The vessels were not made by magic or by machines. They were made by hands that had done nothing else for 1,000 years. And yet the deeper unease about the vessels is not only how they were made, but when. Many of the hardest and finest belong to the earliest stretches of Egyptian history, to the centuries before the Great Pyramids, when the civilization was still, by the standard account, finding its feet. The craft of hard stone vessels reached a peak of astonishing skill very early, and then, over later ages, thinned and simplified, as though the most demanding techniques were being lost rather than developed. The stones themselves range across the whole difficult end of the spectrum, not just diorite and basalt, but banded gneiss, breccia flecked like frozen confetti, dense dark schists, and even rock crystal. Pure quartz, the hardest common mineral of all, carved into small clear vessels that seem to defy the very tools available. To shape a bowl from solid quartz with copper and sand is to grind one form of the hardest material with grains of that same hardest material, a slow war of attrition of quartz against quartz, and the survivors of that war sit in museum cases looking as effortless as blown glass. The people who made them were not the monument builders of the Pyramid Age at all, but their distant ancestors, working at the very dawn of the tradition. That is what unsettles the tidy developmental story. The sense that the skill did not climb steadily from crude to fine, but arrived early, near its height, and was afterward gradually forgotten. The finest vessels are not the end point of a long refinement. They are closer to its lost beginning. And yet, look closely at the very finest of them, and the sober position begins quietly to sweat. The symmetry of certain pieces is startling in a way that is hard to convey until you have seen it. Walls of near uniform thickness curving through compound, double-curved shapes. Interiors that seem turned rather than scraped, as smooth and true as if the stone had been spun against a fixed edge on a lathe. A regularity that feels to the modern eye closer to a machine's steady indifference than to a hand grinding blindly through a hole it cannot see into, feeling its way around a cavity it will never directly touch. The question sharpens into something almost uncomfortable. How do you achieve an even, symmetrical, mathematically clean inner surface when you cannot reach it, cannot see it, cannot even fit your hand inside to check your work, and when the material fights you at every single grain? The tools that survive prove that a vessel could be hollowed. They do not, by themselves, fully explain how it was hollowed so well, so consistently, so early. Often before, on the standard timeline, the civilization had even reached the height of its powers. The same discrepancy that haunted the drill cores haunts the jars in a gentler, older key. A method we can broadly reconstruct, straining to account for a precision that seems to outrun it. And in the last few years, that old discomfort has found sharp new instruments to press on it. Instruments the ancient craftsmen never dreamed of, turned now upon their most delicate work, and stirring an argument louder and stranger than anything Petrie left behind. In recent years, a new kind of eye has been turned on those vessels, and it has taken a slow, patient archaeological puzzle and made it loud, public, and combustible. Enthusiasts, engineers, and a handful of researchers began placing museum vessels under laser scanners and computed tomography machines, the same technologies used to inspect precision-engineered parts, building detailed digital models of each object's exact geometry, and then measuring that geometry against the ideals of perfect symmetry. How truly round is the mouth? How closely does one half of the vessel mirror the other across its central axis? How straight does that axis run, and how evenly is the wall thickness distributed all the way around a compound curve? The claims that came out of this work were extraordinary, and they spread far beyond any scholarly journal. Tolerances, some argued, that would be genuinely demanding to hold even with modern machine tools. Surfaces flat and true to within a fraction of a millimeter. Symmetry so exact that, the argument ran, no human hand grinding blindly through a narrow neck could conceivably have produced them. If those measurements were sound, and if they meant what the loudest voices said they meant, the vessels would be pushed clean out of the ordinary story, into the territory of lost machines or lost ages or something stranger yet. And here the voice has to slow down and become very careful, because this is exactly the kind of claim that must be handled with both hands. Much of this scanning has circulated outside the slow, skeptical machinery of peer review, on websites, in videos, in the passionate back and forth of enthusiasts, rather than in the cautious pages where such findings are usually tested and torn at. Some of it rests on a single striking object, or on a handful, rather than on a broad and representative sample. Some of the most dramatic figures have not been independently repeated by neutral hands with an interest in proving them wrong, which is the real test any surprising measurement must survive. And crucially, a very high degree of symmetry does not by itself require a machine. A skilled craftsman turning a piece steadily against a fixed abrasive edge, rotating the work rather than the tool, the way a potter centers clay, can produce astonishing roundness and balance, because the rotation itself averages out the errors of the hand. Human beings, given a lifetime and the right technique, are capable of far more precision than we tend to credit them with, precisely because we ourselves have forgotten how to do such things by hand. So, the honest state of the matter is this: held steadily and without drama, the finest vessels are genuinely remarkably fine. Fine enough to unsettle serious and careful people who have no wish to be unsettled. And at the same time, the most spectacular numbers attached to them remain contested, not yet firmly confirmed, and very easy to overstate in the retelling. Both of those things are true at once, and the discomfort of holding them together is real. There is a further trap in this kind of measurement that deserves naming because it catches even careful people. When you scan a 5,000-year-old object and find its geometry imperfect in some places, you cannot always tell whether you are measuring the maker's intention or the accidents of 5,000 years, a chip, a knock, a slow warping, an ancient repair, the wear of countless hands. And when you find it startlingly perfect, you must ask whether the standard you are holding it to is one the maker ever cared about, or one you have imported from your own machine-age assumptions about what precision means. A craftsman turning a bowl against a fixed abrasive point, rotating the work steadily, will naturally produce a form that is round and balanced about its axis, because the spinning averages away the tremor of the hand. The same reason a potter's wheel yields symmetry that no amount of careful modeling by hand could match. Symmetry, in other words, can be a free gift of the right technique rather than the fingerprint of an impossible tool. None of this proves the dramatic claims wrong. It simply means that a scan is not a verdict, that a number is only as good as the skeptical hands that have tried and failed to overturn it, and that, in a subject this charged, the loudest measurements are precisely the ones most in need of quiet, repeated, adversarial checking before they are allowed to carry the weight of a revolution. The finest vessels remain a genuine wonder. The wildest figures attached to them remain for now unproven, and the honest mind has to sit in the uncomfortable space between those two facts without bolting toward the exit that grandeur offers. What is not in doubt in the end is that the best of these objects are good enough to open a gap, a space between what the surviving tools obviously explain and what the surviving objects apparently achieve. And that gap, in this subject above every other, does not stay empty for long. Discomfort in the absence of a settled answer is a kind of vacuum, and vacuums pull. They pull careful researchers toward ever more ingenious reconstructions of how patient hands might have done it after all. But they also pull other things, louder things, stranger things, explanations that do not merely stretch the ordinary story, but abandon it altogether. Because if you have decided, rightly or wrongly, that the people of the standard timeline simply could not have made these vessels and cut these cores with copper and sand, then you are left needing someone else to have done it. And once that need takes hold, it tends to find, waiting for it, a whole imagined world ready to step into the space where the honest answer admits it is only probable. That world has a name and a long and stubborn history, and it is worth walking into it carefully. Not to be captured by it, but to understand exactly why it fails as an explanation, even as it succeeds so completely as a story. Where an answer runs thin, a louder answer tends to rush in to fill the space. And around Egyptian stonework, the loudest of all has a very particular and seductive shape. In its various forms, it runs like this. The Egyptians of the standard story could not possibly have done this work with copper and sand, and therefore someone or something else must have. Perhaps an earlier, lost civilization, more advanced than any we admit to, whose tools and cities have crumbled entirely to dust while their granite alone endured. Perhaps visitors from elsewhere, from beyond the sky, sharing forbidden techniques. Perhaps a forgotten age of machines whose metal has long since rusted to nothing, leaving only the marks of its work pressed permanently into the hardest stone. One of the best-known versions of this reads the great structures not as tombs at all, but as apparatus, as machines in their own right, humming with some lost purpose, and reads the very core that troubled Petrie, that clean spiral-cutting quartz and feldspar alike, as the unmistakable fingerprint of a powered lathe or drill, a genuine machine tool spinning far faster and pressing far harder than any hand-turned copper tube ever could. And it is worth understanding, without contempt, why this reading has such a powerful grip. It takes the honest, specific, unresolved detail, the one that even the careful skeptics admit is only probably explained, and it offers, in exchange for that small, nagging uncertainty, a complete and thrilling world. It answers the discomfort not by living with it, but by dissolving it into wonder. But it fails as an explanation. And it is important to be clear about exactly why, because the reason is not snobbery or the defense of orthodoxy. It fails because it explains one hard-to-account-for groove by inventing an entire civilization, an entire technology, an entire lost age, for which no other trace whatsoever exists. There are no factories, no power lines, no machine shops, no tailings of an industry, no metal beyond the copper and bronze we already know they had, no debris, no failed prototypes, no worn-out machine parts, nothing at all but the finished stone itself, pressed into service to stand in for a whole vanished world that has conveniently left no other evidence behind. And that is simply not how evidence is allowed to work. A single hard-to-explain groove is a puzzle, a real one worth measuring and arguing over. It is not, by itself, a civilization. To leap from the one to the other is to answer a small mystery by manufacturing an enormous one, and then to feel that the enormous one, being grander, must somehow be more satisfying. The same objects get cited again and again in these accounts: the drill cores, the thin stone vessels, the great granite boxes with their flat interior walls that sit in the tunnels beneath the desert at Saqqara. Each is genuinely impressive. None of them, individually or together, requires a lost super-civilization. They require patient people, enormous stretches of time, and techniques we can broadly reproduce, plus, at the very edge, a residue of a few unexplained specifics that the grand theories seize upon as their whole foundation. Consider the great stone boxes that lie in the tunneled galleries beneath the desert at Saqqara. Enormous chests of hard granite and dark stone, each cut from a single block, their interiors hollowed out and their inner walls left remarkably flat and square, sealed with lids of matching weight. They are genuinely staggering objects, and they are a favorite of the grand theories, offered again and again as proof that no ordinary chisel and sand civilization could be responsible. And they are staggering. But staggering is not the same as impossible, and impressive is not the same as inexplicable. The flatness of a large surface can be achieved by grinding against another flat surface with abrasive between them, the two lapping each other true. The squareness of a corner is a matter of patience and checking, not of magic. What the grand theories consistently do is take the genuine difficulty of these objects, which no honest person denies, and treat difficulty itself as evidence for an entirely different history of the world. It is a subtle slide, and a seductive one. Because the boxes are hard to make, someone impossible must have made them. Because the vessels are fine, they must be machined. Because one groove cuts oddly, a lost technology must have carved it. Each step feels reasonable in isolation, and yet the whole staircase leads somewhere the evidence never actually goes. The proper response to a hard-to-explain object is not to invent an easier-to-imagine maker. It is to keep the object, keep the difficulty, and keep looking, which is slower and less thrilling, and very much harder to make into a story that holds a restless mind at midnight. And that is the quietly instructive thing about why the fantasy persists, decade after decade, no matter how often it is answered. It persists precisely because the mainstream, in its proper caution, keeps saying two things in the same breath, and only ever hears the first half repeated back. It says, we can reproduce the method, the paradox is solved, there is nothing impossible here. And then it says, more softly, because honesty requires it. The last few specifics of that one groove, that particular rate, that indifference to hardness, are best described as probable rather than certain. The grand theories feed entirely on that second, softer clause. They live in the gap between probable and certain, a gap the careful researchers leave open out of intellectual honesty and the dramatic ones mistake for a door standing ajar into another world. Discard the machines. Discard the lost civilization and the visitors from the sky and the humming apparatus. Discard all of it as the evidence demands. And still, when the dust of the grand theories has settled and blown away, the small stubborn fact they were all built upon is still lying there in its drawer, still real, still measured, still not quite fully closed. The fantasy was never the problem. The fantasy was only what grew, luxuriant and impossible, in the thin, honest crack that the truth had left open. And so, having refused the easy grandeur, one is thrown back on the ordinary marvels, which are in their own way harder to sit with. There is one more of them to consider before the gap can be looked at directly. Not a hole bored through stone, but the mirror-bright skin left on its surface. Set the drilling aside for a moment and run a hand, in the mind, across a finished surface, because the polish is its own quiet astonishment and it carries its own missing page. Consider the great dark sarcophagus of granite standing in the heart of the largest pyramid, its sides ground flat and square, its interior corners cut crisp and clean, its walls bearing here and there the long, faint striations of the saws that shaped them, and, in one place, the circular scar where a tube drill overran and bit too far. Consider the seated statue of a king carved from diorite, a stone so hard, so dense and dark that later ages struggled even to scratch it, brought to a surface so smooth and so lustrous that after 4,500 years of dust and handling, it still catches the light like the surface of deep water. Consider the lower courses of one of the pyramids, faced in granite, left deliberately unfinished. The blocks still wearing the rounded bosses of surplus stone that the dressers would have ground away, frozen forever in mid-labor so that we can see the work stopped part-way and understand that the smoothing was done in place, block by hand. Flatness like this and polish like this are achievable. On this everyone agrees, and there is no honest room for mystery in the possibility. You rub the surface with a flat stone and a coarse abrasive until it is roughly true. Then with a finer abrasive, then finer still and finer again, for a very long time. And the surface grows flatter and the scratches grow smaller until at last they vanish below the reach of the eye and the stone begins to gleam. Nothing exotic is required at any step. The great granite sarcophagus in the largest pyramid carries its own small telling details for anyone who looks closely. It is slightly wider than the ascending passage that leads up to the chamber it sits in, which means it could not have been carried up after the pyramid was built and must have been placed while the structure was still rising around it, a chest set in its room and then walled in for eternity. Its surfaces bear the faint parallel scars of the saws that shaped it, and in one spot the curved overrun of a tube drill that bit a little too far and left its signature behind, a workman's small permanent slip preserved across 5,000 years. And there is a quieter, sadder object that speaks to the same craft. The dark stone sarcophagus of another pyramid's king, recovered in the 19th century and loaded onto a ship to be carried to a museum in Europe, a ship that sank in the Mediterranean with the sarcophagus aboard. so that a coffin of hard stone that had survived 4,500 years in the Egyptian sand now lies somewhere on the sea floor, lost a second time, this time for good. These are not mysteries in the grand sense. They are the human residue of the work. The drill that slipped, the box too big for its own door, the treasure that drowned on its way to being admired. But they anchor the abstraction. Behind every flat granite face and every polished statue, there were real men grinding real stone, making real mistakes, and leaving behind, in the marks and the losses, the faint, warm evidence of hands that once knew exactly what they were doing and told no one how. What is required, and here the strangeness moves from the physical into the human, is a quantity of skilled, patient, coordinated labor that is genuinely difficult to hold steady in the mind. Think in terms not of hours, but of working lives. A single large, flat granite surface, ground true and polished to a shine entirely by hand with loose abrasive, represents an ocean of repetitive effort. Thousands upon thousands of strokes, days folding into weeks, the same motion repeated until it wore grooves into the men as surely as into the stone. And every sarcophagus had many such surfaces. Every statue, every polished floor, every hard stone temple facing demanded the same drowning quantity of patience, multiplied across a whole civilization and sustained across many centuries. Picture the sheer organization of it. The feeding and housing and directing of the workers, the supply of abrasive, the grading of the sands from coarse to fine, the passing down of the technique from one generation of grinders to the next. And here is the human strangeness, sharper than any groove. A society organized enough and wealthy enough and motivated enough to pour that ocean of labor into the hardest stone over and over for the better part of 1,000 years. And it left almost nothing behind to describe how. No manual of the craft, no diagram of the drill or the saw, no apprentice's practice tablet, no master's notes on how deep to press or how coarse to begin, or how to tell when a surface was truly flat. Nothing that a modern engineer would recognize as documentation of a difficult and demanding technical process carried out at an industrial scale. The finished results are everywhere, in every major museum on Earth. The knowledge of exactly how they were made is very nearly nowhere. There is, at least, some faint warmth to be found in the traces of the people themselves. Near the Great Pyramids, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of a whole settlement built to house and feed the workforce. Bakeries turning out bread in enormous quantity, breweries, storerooms, sleeping quarters, the bones of cattle and fish brought in to feed the laborers, and the graves of workers laid to rest with a dignity that argues against the old image of whip-driven slaves. These were organized, provisioned, rotated crews of ordinary people, fed and housed by a state that knew exactly how to marshal them. We can, in other words, reconstruct a good deal about the lives of the hands, where they slept, what they ate, how they were mustered, how they were buried. What we cannot reconstruct is what those same hands knew. The village tells us how the workers were kept alive. It does not tell us the one thing we most want to know: the feel of the cut, the judgment of the master, the wordless expertise that turned copper and sand and stone into an obelisk. We have their bread ovens and their graves. We do not have their knowing. And that absence, that vast, echoing silence where the instructions should be, is, in the end, a far deeper mystery than any single spiral groove. It is not the mystery of a lost machine. It is the mystery of a lost knowing. And to understand why that knowing vanished so completely, one has to think not about conspiracies or catastrophes, but about the very ordinary way in which almost all human skill has always been lost. For all they built, the Egyptians were strangely quiet about how they built it, and that silence deserves to be looked at directly and calmly, rather than mistaken for something sinister or deliberate. They were not, in the ordinary sense, a secretive people. Their tombs are covered in scenes of daily work, men brewing beer and baking bread, threshing and winnowing grain, netting fish from the river, hammering sheets of gold, herding cattle, tallying the harvest, butchering oxen, weaving cloth. Craft was celebrated on their walls, not hidden away. There are even scenes of stoneworkers at their benches, and, as we have seen, the very sign that stood in their writing for the idea of a craftsman is thought to descend from the image of the drill itself. The tool at the center of this whole long puzzle, worn so deep into their world that it became a letter. So the knowledge was there, and it was honored, and it was ordinary enough to be painted on a wall for eternity. What is missing from all those cheerful scenes is not the fact of the work, but the technical grain of it, the numbers, the tolerances, the exact sequence of abrasives from coarse to fine, the pressures, the speeds, the tricks, the failures, and how they were recognized and corrected. The scenes show that stone was drilled. They do not show, and were never meant to show, how to drill it well. It is worth noticing what the Egyptians did write down, because the contrast is revealing. They were prodigious record keepers of a particular kind. They tallied harvests and taxes, listed the names of kings and the years of their reigns, recorded rations and work gangs and the movement of grain, inscribed prayers and spells for the dead across the walls of tombs, and copied out hymns and stories and letters. Writing for them was for administration, for religion, for memory of persons and events. It was not, on the whole, for the transmission of technical procedure. There is no Egyptian equivalent of an engineer's handbook, no treatise on how to true a granite surface, or grade an abrasive, or judge the temper of a copper tool. This is not a peculiar Egyptian failing. It is nearly universal in the ancient world and long after. The knowledge of the skilled trades lived almost entirely outside of text, in the bodies and habits of the people who practiced them, transmitted by apprenticeship rather than by the written word. A boy did not read how to drill stone. He stood beside a man who drilled stone for years, and slowly the man's knowing seeped into the boy's hands until it was his own, and then one day the man was gone, and the boy was the master, and so it passed, generation to generation, entirely by touch and imitation, entirely unwritten. Such a chain is astonishingly durable while it holds, and astonishingly total in its disappearance when it finally breaks. There is nothing left to consult. There was never anything to consult. The manual was always a living person, and living persons do not survive. And that kind of knowledge, in almost every pre-modern craft the world over, was never written down at all. Not because anyone chose to conceal it, but because it was not the sort of thing that lived in writing. It lived in the hands. It passed from a master to an apprentice across years of watching and doing, a slow bodily transfer of feel and judgment that no papyrus could have captured even if some scribe had thought to try. How hard to press, when the sand had gone dull and needed changing. How to read the sound and the resistance of the cut through the shaft in your palms, when a surface was truly flat, not by measuring it, but by knowing it. This is tacit knowledge, the knowledge of the skilled body, and it is astonishingly fragile precisely because it is never stored anywhere outside living people. When a workshop closed, when a lineage of craftsmen was broken, when the great demand for hard stone work faded, and the last men who had ground diorite every day of their lives grew old and were carried to their own tombs, the feel went with them into the ground unrecorded. It is worth remembering that the Egyptians themselves seem to have lost some of this. The extraordinary hard stone vessel industry, so dazzling in the earliest periods, thinned and faded in later ages. The peak of certain techniques lay near the beginning, not the end. Even within Egypt's own long story, the knowing was already slipping away. This is the ordinary explanation, and it is almost certainly the true one. No fire, no purge, no jealous priesthood guarding secrets, just the quiet, universal closing of a door that no one thought to prop open, repeated across generations until the room behind it was dark. Roman builders made a concrete that outlasted empires, and the precise knack of it was lost for centuries before it was painstakingly puzzled back together in modern times. The smiths who made the finest patterned crucible steel took the exact recipe to their graves, and later ages could only stand before the surviving blades and wonder. Human history is, in large part, a history of such quiet forgettings, of skills that burned bright in living hands and then simply went out, leaving only their products behind to be marveled at by people who could no longer make them. The Egyptian stoneworkers belonged to that long, ordinary procession of the forgotten. Nothing was suppressed, nothing was hidden. The knowledge was lost the way most ancient knowledge is lost. But that ordinary explanation carries a sting that the grand theories, for all their nonsense, at least never have to feel, because a silence is precisely the thing that can never be cross-examined. A method held only in vanished hands cannot be summoned to confirm or deny anything at all. It can only be guessed at endlessly. And every guess, however careful, however well supported by copper and sand and patient experiment, remains a guess. A reconstruction offered in place of a recovery, standing in for a truth that took its real shape into the dark for good. It is worth being very honest about what a reconstruction actually is, because that distinction sits quietly at the center of everything this long night has circled, and it is the one thing most often blurred in the telling. When a modern experimenter takes copper and sand and water and bores a hole through granite, producing a spiraled core with his own hands, something real and valuable has genuinely happened. A possibility has been demonstrated. A supposed impossibility has been dissolved. An objection has been answered in the most concrete way there is, by doing the thing. That is knowledge, and it is the best kind of knowledge available on this question, and it should never be sneered at or waved away. But a demonstration that a thing could have been done in a certain way is not the same as a record that it was done in that way. It is a hypothesis, fitted backward to an ancient result and tested for plausibility, and found, impressively, to pass. That is a real achievement. It is also not certainty, and the difference between the two is not a technicality. Think of it this way. Suppose 1,000 years from now, every recipe on Earth had been lost, and someone found a perfectly preserved loaf of ancient bread. A clever experimenter might, after much trial, produce a loaf that looked and tasted almost identical using flour, water, salt, and yeast. That would be a genuine triumph. It would prove the loaf could be made simply, that no lost magic was required. But it would not tell you whether the original baker had used exactly that flour, that ratio, that rising time, that oven. Only that some plausible path led to a similar result. There might be several such paths. The experimenter's loaf is a hypothesis wearing the costume of an answer, and the gap between the two is invisible right up until you insist on it. So it is with the granite. The reconstructed core proves a path exists. It does not prove it was the path, or the only path, or the exact path, and it cannot. Because the one witness who could confirm it, the man who actually made the ancient core, left no statement, only his silent, discarded plug of stone. We are, in the end, reading intentions off of an artifact, inferring a vanished process from its frozen product, and calling the inference knowledge because it is the best we have and because it works. And it is the best we have. But a reconstruction that could be true is a different creature from a record that is true. And the whole quiet drama of this subject lives in the refusal of that difference to close, no matter how good the reconstruction becomes. The ancient driller left no account of his own pressures, his own grit, his own rhythm, the particular trick his master taught him that shaved days off the work, the small refinements 1,000 years of workshops had folded into the craft. We have his core. We have our modern reconstruction of how he might have made it. And running between the two, thin as the translucent wall of one of those early stone jars, is a gap, the gap between what we can reproduce and what they actually did. And we tend to talk straight across that gap as though it were solidly flawed, when in truth it is only spanned by inference. Hold, one more time, the object at the heart of all this, because it grounds the whole meditation in something real and coolly physical. That small cylinder of granite is not a legend, not a rumor, not a shape glimpsed in the desert haze. It sits in a museum collection in London, catalogued and numbered, a plug of stone the length of a hand with its single spiral groove winding down its flank. It can be, and it is, taken out and examined again whenever some new instrument is invented that might read its surface more finely than the last generation could. Petrie measured it with his eyes and his careful hands and his engineer's instruments. Later scholars measured it again with better optics. Others have scanned it, modelled it, photographed its surface under raking light to throw every groove into relief. Each new machine turns the old core a little further under the lamp and reads the same helix, and the argument renews itself in slightly updated language around the same fraction of a millimeter. The object itself does not change. It has not changed in 5,000 years, and it will not change now. Only the sharpness of our looking changes, generation by generation, instrument by instrument. And this is the strange, humbling shape of the whole inquiry. A fixed, silent, unchanging thing, examined by a long succession of people who each believe their tools are finally fine enough to close the question, and each of whom hands it on still open to the next. So far, every sharpening of the looking has narrowed the mystery without quite extinguishing it. The residue has shrunk with each careful pass. It has never yet reached zero, which raises the last question worth asking honestly before the lamp is turned down for the night. If the gap keeps narrowing but never closes, what exactly is the thing that stays behind in it? The small, stubborn something that the sand and the copper and the scanners have never managed to grind entirely away? Bring the strands together, patiently, one by one, and the gap narrows almost to nothing, which is the most honest and least dramatic place this whole story can come to rest. Begin with the copper tube and the loose quartz sand, proven by living hands to cut granite and leave a spiraled core. Add real pressure, not the timid load of a cautious modern experiment worried about snapping a fragile tube, but heavy weights bearing down hard, the kind a workshop willing to sacrifice copper by the pound could easily apply, forcing the abrasive into the stone and driving the cut faster and deeper with every turn. Add the behavior of the tool itself, which is subtler than it first appears. As a copper edge works, it loads up with embedded grains of abrasive and work hardens under the pressure, so that the rim becomes a charged, hardened cutting face that can carve far more evenly and aggressively than bare soft metal ever would. The copper, in effect, becoming a temporary matrix holding hard particles in place, edging quietly towards the very fixed point cutting that Petrie once imagined, without any jeweler ever setting a gem. Add centuries of accumulated skill, whole dynasties of workshops refining the same technique until men could feel through the shaft exactly how the stone was yielding and adjust without thought. Fold in the real possibility that the abrasive was sometimes coarser or harder than plain river sand, crushed emery, corundum-bearing grit, sharper and more relentless than anyone repeating the experiment with ordinary sand would assume. Do all of this, honestly and together, and the residue shrinks until it is very small indeed. The most elegant part of this convergence is the way it quietly reconciles the two theories that once seemed opposed, the loose sand of the septics and the fixed cutting points of Petrie's imagination. For the truth may lie precisely between them. Under great pressure, the soft copper does not merely carry the abrasive, it captures it, the hardest grains embedding themselves into the metal's surface and lodging there, so that the working face of the tool becomes charged, studded with fixed points that were never deliberately set but simply pressed home by the work itself. Such a self-arming tool would behave far more like a true blade than like a passive carrier of drifting grit. It would trace a clean, regular helix because its cutting points are momentarily fixed. It would advance faster than idle grinding because those points are driven straight down under load. And it would cut quartz and feldspar to nearly the same depth because the embedded grains are themselves as hard as quartz, ploughing through the hardest crystal by force rather than rolling harmlessly across it. Petrie was not wrong to sense that something with fixed teeth had made those marks. He was only wrong to imagine a jeweler setting the teeth by hand. The stone set its own teeth, in the copper, in the doing. The paradox and its solution turn out to have been hiding inside each other all along. The soft tool becoming hard exactly where it needed to, for exactly as long as it was pressed against the work. Most careful researchers now believe that this is enough, that the spiral, the rate, and even the unsettling indifference to the difference between quartz and feldspar can, in principle, all be accounted for by loaded copper, heavy pressure, hard abrasive, and 1,000 years of practiced hands. A charged, hardened tool driven downward with force would cut a regular helix. It would advance faster than gentle grinding suggests, and it would cross a quartz crystal without much noticing, because the hard particles doing the actual cutting are as hard as the quartz and are being pressed straight through it, not rolled idly across its surface. The impossible has become the merely difficult, and the merely difficult has become the ordinary, staggering work of extraordinarily patient people. That is very likely the true answer, or close to it, and it should be said clearly rather than left in shadow for the sake of atmosphere. But notice, at the very end of the narrowing, what refuses to disappear no matter how far the gap is closed. What remains is not really a method at all, it is a certainty. The Egyptians knew in their hands, in their bodies, in the unrecorded feel of the craft, exactly what they were doing. We know, in our reconstructions, approximately what they must have done. And that thin, permanent margin between knowing and reconstructing, between having done a thing and having worked out how it might have been done, is the one thing that the copper and the sand and the scanning machines have never been able to grind away. The mystery was never really in the stone. It was always in the difference between making something and merely explaining it. The core still exists. It rests in its drawer in a museum in London, a plug of rose-grey granite no longer than a hand, cool to the touch and heavier than it looks, its single spiral groove winding down into shadow exactly as it has for 5,000 years. It was never meant to be seen. It was the waste, the discarded centre, the useless middle that fell away when the real work was finished and carried off to be raised into some wall or floor or great box that has itself long since crumbled or been quarried away by later hands, or lies buried under sand that no one now thinks to move. The thing that mattered is gone. The thing that was thrown away survives. And it survives carrying the one record its makers ever left of themselves without meaning to. Not a word, not a diagram, not a boast, only the trace of emotion, the frozen memory of a tool turning and biting slowly downward through the stone. A groove is not an explanation. It is only the evidence that something once turned here, with force, with intention, with a skill that knew precisely what it wanted from the rock. The hand that pressed it, the eye that judged the depth, the accumulated knowing that told a man when to lean harder and when to ease off and feed in more sand. All of that ground itself away as surely and as quietly as the copper did, worn thin, then worn to nothing, until only the negative remained, the shape of an absence pressed permanently into stone. And perhaps that is the truest thing the granite has to teach on a night meant for letting go of the day. We have learned to make a groove like this one. We have proven the paradox was never a wall. And still, when the newest machine is turned on that oldest cylinder and reads the spiral one more time, something in the reading stays just out of reach, the way the far inner shoulder of a narrow-necked jar stays forever out of reach of the hand that shaped it, felt but never seen, known but never touched. A civilization can leave its results perfectly intact and its knowing perfectly gone, and the two are not the same and never were. The stone remembers the motion. It does not remember the mind. It holds the path of the tool with perfect, patient fidelity and tells us nothing at all of the thought that guided it, the voice that taught it, the ordinary afternoon in which it was made. Somewhere beneath the desert, in the sealed galleries and the museum drawers and the unfinished bed at Aswan, where 1,000-ton obelisk still waits to rise and never will, that quiet difference lies in the dark, ground fine as quartz dust, patient as stone, refusing to be either fully solved or entirely forgotten, turning slowly under every new light we will ever think to bring.